Hi, this is Jim. Today we're building the Rextra.
One of my favorite parts about Hacker models is that they always include a manual inside of the box, but I always go to the internet and print out the color version because I like seeing it in full color. Then we have the power combo. I have the Vertex power combo which has a reversible ESC to do some 4D flying. I'm excited about that. This has the motor and the ESC right in there. We have our propellers and we have our servos. Aside from power combo, we also have a receiver, and I don't go anywhere without my foam tack. I keep it in my pocket with me. I love it. I had some for breakfast. I'm just kidding, don't eat it. But I do love my foam tack. Let's get going on the build.
Okay, the first thing I like to do is take everything on the box and start organizing. I'm going to take my carbon fiber pieces and set them aside, along with my hardware kit, and then we're going to grab everything that needs to get folded over. So that's going to be the rudder and the ailerons. I put some weight on those and then leave them for about an hour. While they're just sitting there, let's take apart the servo extensions and then we'll get those glued together. So I've taken out all the horns and we're going to be using 4 mounting screws to hold these in place. So we're just going to press them into place, run the screw into them, and that's going to be it. I'm not going to bother with any glue or anything like that. This is enough to hold it in place for me. We are going to clip off the end of each of these screws with some diagonal cutters and use some eye protection because those tend to shoot off. Now we're going to bind the radio, we're going to calibrate the ESC, we're going to center our servos and verify motor direction. There's a whole video on this in the description that goes into much more detail. Next up, we're going to grab some parchment paper or wax paper so that way we don't glue our model to the table, and we're going to glue the wings to the horizontal fuselage. I prefer to use foam tack for all of my foam to foam connections, but you could also use CA and Kicker. Now we're going to work on the wing spars. So first I got to find them, and then we're going to dry fit them, and then I'll fill the slot with foam tack, press it into place, and then we'll repeat those steps on the leading edge of the wing. Then we'll use some batteries to hold these in place, and then we're going to glue on the front part of the horizontal fuselage, and then the stiffeners that go down the entire length of the plane. Now there is something a little tricky on these. They do go over each of those 2 pieces of carbon fiber from the wing spars. And we are going to leave these sticking out of the front of the plane. Don't be tempted to clip them off. We do use them later. Next up, we're going to be cutting all of the carbon fiber pieces for the ailerons. And once we get those pieces all cut, we're just going to be doing a dry fit, and then we'll glue them into place. Sometimes when doing the dry fit, you have to do a little trimming or expand the slot a little bit with a knife. It sort of depends on the situation. So I'm just continuing to dry fit everything into place. And on the rudder here, there are 3 stiffeners that go into it. I did miss one. There's supposed to be one that goes right here. I did that later. Now we're done test fitting. We're going to take them all back out, fill all the slots with glue, and then place them all back in and weigh it down. And I'm using foam tack on all of these slots. You could definitely use CA and Kicker if you like, but I just like the way that foam tack sets up. We do the same on the rudder, and then we'll go to the hardware bag for the tail skid, and there's also a small tail skid on the rudder as well. Next up is going to be reinforcement tape. We're going to cut this up into 12 equal size pieces, and then we'll apply these on both sides of the ailerons and the rudder. This is something I usually forego on my models, but in this case it's in the manual, so I wanted to cover it and show you guys how I did it. So you have to put down a little bit of CA first, because that gives the tape really something to adhere to. We also don't want the tape limiting travel of any of these surfaces, so make sure that you're having it freely move while you're gluing it down. You can see here how it goes all the way into the hinge on this side. And you see here we want to make sure we can flex it both directions with a full travel without binding. Next up, we're going to be moving on to the aileron bracing. Make sure you put the bracing support at 90 degrees. Hacker was kind enough to include a sort of a square or a jig to make sure everything's at 90 degrees. So you're welcome to use that. I like to use my little square because it gets into places a little easier. Once those are in, we're going to start gluing in the bracing. And they have a little slot, so pretty straightforward on where to place them, and just a little bit of glue on each end. Next up, we're going to be moving on to the elevator. So first thing we're going to do is grab the control horn, and we're going to put on this ball link. And then we'll grab our carbon fiber tube. I had a hard time pushing that on, so I just used a piece of wood with a hole drilled in it to kind of push it down onto it, and that seemed to work. Then for the rest of these parts, I am missing some parts right here. I should have also had these little circles, so don't forget those. We're going to put all of these onto the tube, and then we'll be able to start our dry fit and get everything into place. And you'll see here I'm doing some measurement to keep everything nice and aligned using these spacers. And then I'll be gluing it in place with CA. Remember, you don't want to glue the parts that swivel, so pay extra attention that you don't get any glue where it shouldn't go. And having those spacers in there while it's drying is really helpful so it doesn't bow. Then we'll start working on the lower half of the vertical fuselage, but first I forgot a piece of carbon fiber on the rudder, so let's glue that into place. Perfect. Then this goes all the way up to the front. Mine was sticking up a little bit proud of the foam. I probably could have run the X-Acto along it and got it further down in it, but I just went with it the way it was. And as I've learned from previous issues, I didn't throw a whole lot of kicker onto this because a lot of times that will make this whole thing bow, and so I wanted it to stay nice and straight. This half moon piece wasn't sitting flush, so I trimmed a little piece off of it, and then it snuggled right in there. Initially, I didn't know what this little piece was, but it's actually the servo mount. Then we're going to be ready to put on the lower half of the vertical fuselage. The dry fit looks good, so we're ready to glue it in place. I put the glue down the middle, press it into place, and then we're going to use the jig that Hacker included, and then check for square all the way down. Now we're ready to start on the bracing. I just use diagonal cutters to cut these to length. Some people use a Dremel tool with a cutoff wheel. Some people also sand the ends of their carbon fiber braces in order to give it a little more grip where it glues, but I've not found that to be necessary. And on these, I give it a quick dry fit, put some glue on the ends, and then put it into place. We just want to make sure that the fuselage is staying at 90 degrees, so I'll check that every so often. Okay, everything's looking nice and straight. Now we're ready to move on to the wing strut bracing, but I'm having a hard time finding them. If you look real close, there's just a slit where they're cut out. So once I found those, they were easy to pick out, and then glue these into place. And these wing struts get cut to size, and then they get secured into the little half moon pieces and through the wing support. Next up is going to be installing the landing gear. We feed those through the fuselage, and then I'm going to use some thread to lock them in place with some CA. I give 4 or 5 wraps, and then cut it off flush. Now there's just a couple more braces up at the front. And then we're ready to cut both of the stiffeners that go all the way through both halves of the vertical fuselage. We get them into place, and then we're able to glue on the top half of the vertical fuselage. The manual does show that you should hold off on gluing the area by the pockets for the servos because you want room to be able to place those in. And then we've got one more stiffener up at the front. And again, you don't want to cut it flush. It's supposed to stick out a little bit. Make sure everything's at 90 degrees. And now we're ready for the control horns on the surfaces. It's easier to get these clevises on now rather than when the horns are mounted onto the plane. And this next part is a little bit embarrassing, but I accidentally installed the aileron control horns on the wrong side of the wing. So they're supposed to go on that side, not that side. So learn from my mistake and don't mount them on top. I don't know what I was thinking, but that's okay. I fixed it later. And now we can glue the rudder and vertical stabilizer onto the fuselage. Then we can glue on the tail skid. And then we'll be cutting a few more bracing pieces and installing those. Once we get all those bracings finalized, then we are ready to start on the motor mount. We're going to thread these little carbon fiber pieces through the motor mount. Then we'll add glue and trim off the carbon fiber. And then we're ready for servos. The manual said to put all the horns onto the servos along with their clevises, and that seemed to work out pretty well. Then we can start installing our servos. I start with the rudder and elevator. And don't forget to glue in the part of the vertical fuselage that is between the two servos. And it was right about here that I realized I put on my aileron control horns in the wrong place. So I take those out and then glue them in the bottom where they should go. Easy fix there. And now we can mount the aileron servos. And then we'll move on to our push rods. We pop out all the push rod guides, give them a little glue, press them into place, and then we can run our push rod through the guides. Same thing on the other side. Then we'll glue the push rod into the clevis. And then we'll cut it off to length on the other end and glue it in place. This is where I also glue in the elevator control horn onto the carbon fiber tube. Now we're ready to do the same thing for the rudder. And then we'll repeat those steps for the aileron push rods. When gluing in the push rod, you want to make sure that the aileron is in line with the fuselage. Then we install the motor. And the ESC and receiver. Then we'll glue on the wheel skids and the pants. And then we'll balance the propeller. And then I'm going to get out my Velcro and my battery and set the CG at 225 because that's right in the middle of the range that they give. And that seemed to be about the right place. And now we are done with the build. Let's see how she flies. So the very first thing that I felt when flying the Rextra is that it feels really big in comparison to the 32-inch plane, something like the Hacker Laser 230. It has similar flying characteristics because it's nice and light. It's got the super thin EPP that's nice and stiff, and it's really floaty, but it is so big in comparison. It has a really cool feel to it. I'm giving it some nice slow maneuvers to feel out the balance and to see if there's anything that's rolling it in one direction or another. I haven't put any trim on it whatsoever. I do need to dial in the CG, of course, but it feels pretty darn fantastic. First knife edge spin, it did really well. The full floating elevator really makes it whip around, so it really likes those type of maneuvers. It felt sharp and precise for these 3D turns. The power on this, since I'm using the Vertex power combo, it is insane. Everybody was telling me, oh, you're going to love this. It's going to be great. And I was like, yeah, we'll see. It's a motor, but it feels like you're running it on 3S instead of 2S. So I cannot get over how much power the Vertex combo gives it. So you can go from doing nice, smooth transitions to really aggressive maneuvers very quickly, and it feels really nice with that. I try a little square loop here, and it takes it really well. It was a lot of fun flying it, and the ability that the plane has far exceeds my ability as a pilot, so it'll be really fun to learn and grow with. I'm thinking this is going to be my go-to freestyle practice plane. I've got about 3 or 4 miles per hour of wind out tonight, and it feels really good in that. Anything more, and it's going to start to be more of a challenge to keep it from getting blown around too much because it is a light model. Here's an example of how it goes from transitioning to something smooth and slow to something quick and fast and aggressive. It really transitions well between that and can really flick itself around, yet still has the feather-light floatiness that really makes you feel in control of the model. So overall, super smooth, yet super aggressive. Not a beginner model whatsoever. This is definitely one that you'll put right into the ground and do some damage to it and have to get some repair done if you're not a little more experienced. I have flown this indoors, and it is a great indoor flyer. There's nothing I would want different from it whatsoever other than just more time to be able to fly it. The one thing I haven't even touched on is that this does have a reversible ESC and motor with it. It came with a reversible prop so that I can start practicing more 4D, and this will be a really great platform to practice that on because it's so light. It is such a challenge though. I've done it like a couple times on my test plane. I think it'll be much easier to do 4D with this one though, because it's much lighter, and that'll help that a whole lot. Now here you see I was having some issues flying. I came in for a really bad landing. I almost hit myself with the plane, and this is part of the course for building models. Sometimes things just happen, and in this case my rudder wouldn't move. It was making a left-hand turn, and here is why. My servo horn came unscrewed. Not a big deal. I was able to screw it back in and get right back to flying. I know people are interested in the numbers on this. I came out with a total weight without battery of 160 grams. I am running a 2S 550 milliamp hour battery, and that gives me about 5 minutes of flight time. I'm running a 9-inch prop with this setup. If I were going to do 3S, I would switch to an 8-inch prop. I hope you enjoyed the build video, and I hope you enjoy flying your Rextra as much as I do.